Never even think of invading yours, surely. I thought you would not help me openly. He did not dare tell her to leave the wise ones alone. She might well do something to spite him. She had made it plain from the start, if not in words, that she meant to have the upper hand between them. Wouldn't that risk another of the Forsaken finding out? You aren't the only one who knows how to enter people's dreams. The Chosen, she said absently. For a moment, she chewed a full underlip. I've watched the girl's dreams, too. Egwene. Once I thought you had feelings for her. Do you know who she dreams of? Morghez's son and stepson. The son, Gawain, most often. Smiling, she put on a tone of mock shock. You would not believe a simple country girl could have such dreams. She was trying to test his jealousy, he realized. She really thought he warded his dreams to hide thoughts of another woman. The maidens guard me closely, he said dryly. If you want to know how close, look at Essendra's dreams. Spots of color flared in her cheeks. Of course. He was not supposed to see what she was trying. Confusion rolled outside the void. What did she think? Essendra. Lanfear knew she was a dark friend. Lanfear had brought Kadir and the woman to the waste in the first place, and planted most of the jewelry Essendra was accused of stealing. Lanfear's spite was cruel, even when petty. Still, if she thought he could love her, Essendra being a dark friend was probably no obstacle in her eyes. I should have let them send her off to try reaching the Dragon Wall, he went on casually. But who knows what she might have said to save herself. I must protect her and Kadir to some extent in order to protect Asmodean. The color faded, but as she opened her mouth again, a knock came at the door. Rand bounded to his feet. No one would recognize Lanfear, yet if a woman were discovered in his room, a woman whom none of the maidens below had seen enter, questions would be asked, and he had no answers. But Lanfear already had a gateway open, to somewhere full of white silk hangings and silver. Remember that I am your only hope of surviving, my love. It was a very cool voice in which to call someone that. Beside me, you need fear nothing. Beside me, you can rule everything that is or will be. Lifting her snowy skirts, she stepped through, and the gateway went shut. The knock sounded again before he could make himself push away Sidene and haul open the door. Inarla peered past him, suspiciously muttering. I thought perhaps Essendra. She gave him an accusing look. Spear Sisters are searching everywhere for you. No one saw you return. With a shake of her head, she straightened. She always tried to stand as tall as possible. The chiefs have come to speak with the Ka Karn, she said formally. They wait below. They waited on the columned portico, as it turned out, being men. The sky was still dark, but the first glimmers of dawn lined the mountains to the east. If they felt any impatience with the two maidens who stood between them and the tall doors, it did not show on their shadowed faces. The shadow are moving, Han barked as soon as Rand appeared. And the Rain, the Miagoma, the Shianda, every clan. Joining Couladin or me? Rand demanded. The Shaido are moving toward the Jangai Pass, Ruark said. For the others, it is too early to tell. But they are on the march with every spear not needed to defend the holds, herds, and flocks. Rand only nodded. All of his determination not to let anyone else dictate what he would do, and now this. Whatever the other clans intended, Couladin had to plan a crossing into Carian. So much for his grand schemes of imposing peace, if the Shaido ravaged Carian even further while he sat in Rudion, waiting for the other clans. Then we move for the Jangai too, he said finally. We cannot catch him if he means to cross, Aaron cautioned, and Han added sourly. If any of the others are joining him, we will be caught strung out like blind worms in the sun. I won't sit here until I find out, Rand said. If I can't catch Couladin, I mean to be right behind him into Carian. Rouse the spears. We leave as soon after first light as you can manage. Giving him that odd Aiel bow used only on the most formal occasions, 1 foot forward and 1 hand extended, the chiefs departed. Only Han said anything. The Shale Ghoul itself.
Chapter 7. A Departure. Yawning in the early morning grayness, Egwene pulled herself up onto her fog-colored mare, then had to handle her reins smartly as Mist frisked about. The animal had not been ridden in weeks. Aiel not only preferred their own legs, they avoided riding almost completely, though they did use pack horses and pack mules. Even if there had been enough wood to build wagons, the terrain in the waste was not hospitable to wheels, as more than one peddler had learned, to his or her sorrow. She was not looking forward to the long journey west. The mountains hid the sun now, but the heat would grow by the hour once it climbed clear, and there would be no convenient tent to duck into at nightfall. She was not certain that Aiel garb was suitable for riding either. The shawl worn over her head always did a surprisingly good job of keeping the sun off, but those bulky skirts would bare her legs to the thigh if she was not careful. Blisters worried her as much as modesty. The sun on one side, and a month out of the saddle should not have softened her that much. She hoped it had not, or this would be a very long journey. Once she had settled Mist down, Egwene found Amis looking at her, and shared a smile with the Wise One. All of that running the night before was not the reason she was still sleepy. If anything, it had helped her sleep even more soundly. She had found the other woman's dreams last night, and in celebration they had sipped tea in the dream, in Cold Rock's hold, early on an evening when children were playing among the crop-planted terraces, and a pleasant breeze blew down the valley as the sun sank. Of course, that would not have been enough to steal her rest, but she had been so exultant that when she left Amis's dreams she did not stop. She could not then, no matter what Amis would have said. There had been dreams all around, though with most she had no idea whose they were. With most, not all. Mylane had been dreaming of suckling a babe at her breast, and Bear of one of her dead husbands, both of them young and yellow-haired. She had been especially careful not to enter those. The Wise Ones would have known an intruder in an instant, and she shuddered to think of what they would have said before letting her. Rand's dreams had been a challenge, of course, one she could not fail to face. Now that she could flit from dream to dream, how could she not try where the Wise Ones failed? Only, attempting to enter his dreams had been like running headlong into an invisible stone wall. She knew that his dreams lay on the other side, and she was sure she could find a way through, but there had been nothing to work on, nothing to pry at, a wall of nothing. It was a problem she meant to worry at until she solved it. Once she put her mind on something, she could be as persistent as a badger. All around her, Guy Shine were bustling about, loading the Wise One's camp onto mules. Before long, only an Aiel or someone just as skilled at tracking would be able to tell there had ever been tents on that patch of hard clay. The same activity covered the surrounding mountain slopes, and the hubbub extended into the city as well. Not everyone would be going, but thousands would. Aiel thronged the streets, and Master Kader's train of wagons stood strung out along the great plaza, laden with Moiraine's selections, the 3 white-painted water wagons at the end of the line, like huge barrels on wheels, behind 20 mule teams. Kader's own wagon at the head of the column was a little white house on wheels, with steps at the back and a metal stovepipe sticking out of the flat roof. The thick, hawk-nosed merchant, all in ivory-colored silk today, took off his incongruously battered hat as she rode past, his dark, tilted eyes not sharing in the wide smile he flashed at her. She ignored him frostily. His dreams had been decidedly dark and unpleasant, where they were not lewd as well. He ought to have his head dunked in a cask of blue-spine tea, she thought grimly. Approaching the roof of the Maidens, she threaded her way through scurrying Guy Shine and patiently standing mules. To her surprise, one of those loading the maiden's things wore a black robe, not white, a woman by the size of her, and staggering under the weight of a cord-tied bundle on her back. Bending as she guided her past to get a look inside the woman's cowl, Egwene saw Isendra's haggard face, sweat already rolling down her cheeks. She was glad the maidens had stopped letting the woman go outside, or sending her out, more naked than not, but it did seem needlessly cruel to robe her in black. If she was sweating so hard already, she would nearly die once the day's heat took hold. Still, Far Darai's my business was none of hers. Avienda had told her so, gently but firmly. Adeline and Enila had been little short of rude about it, and a wiry white-haired maiden named Sulin had actually threatened to haul her back to the Wise Ones by her ear. Despite her efforts to persuade Avienda to stop addressing her as Aes Sedai, it had been irritating to find that after walking a fine line of uncertainty toward her, the rest of the maidens had come down on the side of her being just another pupil of the Wise Ones. Why, they would not even let her pass the door of the roof unless she claimed to be on an errand. The quickness with which she heeled mist on through the crowd had nothing to do with acceptance of Far Darai's my justice, or her uncomfortable awareness that some of the maidens were eyeing her, no doubt ready to lecture if they thought she intended to interfere. It even had little to do with her dislike of Isendra. She did not want to think about her glimpse of the woman's dreams just before Cowinda had come to rouse her. They had been nightmares of torture, of things being done to the woman that sent Egwene fleeing in horror, and with something dark and evil laughing as it watched her run. No wonder Isendra looked haggard. Egwene had started up out of her sleep so quickly that Cowinda had jumped back from laying a hand on her shoulder. Rand was in the street in front of the maiden's roof, wearing a shufa against the coming sun, and a blue silk coat with enough gold embroidery to befit a palace, though it hung open halfway down the front. His belt had a new buckle, an elaborate thing shaped like a dragon. He really was beginning to think a great deal of himself, that was clear. Standing beside Giadain, his dappled stallion, he was talking with the clan chiefs and some of the Aiel traders who would be staying in Roidion. Jason Natail, nearly at Rand's heels with his harp on his back and holding the reins of a saddled mule bought from Master Kader, was even more elaborately dressed, with silver embroidery nearly hiding his black coat, and spills of white lace at his neck and cuffs. Even his boots were worked in silver where they turned down at the knee. The Gleeman's cloak with its patches did spoil the effect, but Gleemen were odd folk. The male traders wore the Kadin sword, and though their belt knives were smaller than those of warriors, Egwene knew they could all handle a spear if called to. They had something, if not all, of the deadly grace of their brothers who carried the spear. The women traders in loose white algoda blouses and full woolen skirts, headscarves and shawls were more easily distinguishable. Except for maidens and Gaishine and Avienda, Aiel women all wore multiple bracelets and necklaces of gold and ivory, silver and gemstones, some of Aiel make, some traded for, and some looted. Among Aiel traders, though, the women displayed twice as many, if not more. She caught part of what Rand was telling the traders. Give the Ogier stonemasons a free hand on some of what they build, at least. On as much as you can make yourselves. There's no point in just trying to remake the past. So he was having them send to the steading for Ogier to rebuild Roidion. Much of Tar Valon was Ogier work, and where they were left to their own devices, their buildings were enough to take the breath away. Matt was already up on his gelding pips, with his wide-brimmed hat pulled down and the butt of that odd spear resting on his stirrup. As usual, his high-collared green coat looked slept in. She had avoided his dreams. One of the maidens, a very tall, golden-haired woman, gave Matt a roguish grin that seemed to embarrass him. And well it should. She was much too old for him. Egwene sniffed. I know very well what he was dreaming about, thank you very much. She only reined in beside him to look around for Avienda. He told her to be quiet. When she did, he said as she halted mist. He nodded toward Moiraine and Lan, she in pale blue silk, gripping the reins of her white mare, and he in his warder's cloak, holding his great black warhorse. Lan was watching Moiraine intently, expressionless as always, while she looked ready to burst with impatience as she glared at Rand. She started telling him why this is the wrong thing to do. Sounded to me like she was saying it for the 100th time, and he said, "I've decided, Moiraine. Stand over there and be quiet till I have time for you," like he expected her to do as she was told. And she did. Is that steam coming out of her ears? His chortle was so pleased, so amused at his own wit, that she nearly embraced Saidar and taught him a lesson right there in front of everybody. Instead, she sniffed again, loudly enough to let him know it was for him and his wit and his amusement. He gave her a wry, sidelong look and chuckled again, which did nothing for her temper. For a moment she stared at Moiraine, perplexed. The Aes Sedai had done as Rand told her, without protest? That was like one of the wise ones obeying, or the sun rising at midnight. She had heard about the attack, of course. Rumors about giant dogs that left footprints on stone had been all over this morning. She could not see what that could have to do with this, but aside from the news of the Shido, it was the only new thing she knew of, and not enough to produce this reaction. Nothing could produce it that she could think of. Doubtless Moiraine would tell her it was none of her concern, but one way or another she would worry it out. She did not like not understanding things. Spotting Avienda, standing on the bottom step of the roof, she guided Mist around to the other side of the crowd near Rand. The Aiel woman was staring at him as hard as the Aes Sedai did, but with absolutely no expression. She kept turning the ivory bracelet on her wrist over and over, apparently without realizing it. Somehow or other that bracelet was part of the difficulty the woman was having with him. Egwene did not understand. Avienda refused to talk about it, and she could not just ask someone else, not when it might embarrass her friend. Her own flame-carved ivory bracelet was a gift from Avienda, to seal them as near sisters. Her return gift had been the silver necklace the other woman wore, which Master Kader claimed was a Kandori pattern called snowflakes. She'd had to ask Moiraine for enough money, but it had seemed appropriate for a woman who would never see snow, or would not have if she was not leaving the waste. Small chance that she could return before winter. Whatever that bracelet meant, Egwene was confident she could puzzle it out eventually. "Are you all right?" she asked. As she leaned out of her high-cantled saddle, her skirts shifted till her legs showed, but she was concerned enough with her friend to hardly notice. She had to repeat the question before Avienda gave a start and stared up at her. "All right? Of course I am." "Let me speak to the wise ones, Avienda. I'm sure I can convince them that they cannot just make you—" She could not make herself say it, not out here where anyone in the crowd might hear. "Does that still worry you?" Avienda shifted her gray shawl and gave a small shake of her head. "Your customs are still very strange to me." Her eyes drifted back to Rand, like iron filings drawn to a lodestone. "You do not have to be afraid of him." "I am not afraid of any man," the other woman snapped, eyes flashing blue-green fire. "I want no trouble between us, Egwene, but you should not say such things." Egwene sighed. Friend or not, Avienda was quite capable of trying to box her ears when offended enough. In any case, she was not sure she would have admitted it either. Avienda's dream had been too painful to watch for long. Naked but for that ivory bracelet, and that seeming to drag at her as if it weighed 100 pounds, Avienda had been running as hard as she could across a cracked clay flat. And behind her Rand came, a giant twice the size of an ogier, on a huge Geodan, slowly but inexorably catching up. But you could not simply tell a friend that she was lying. Egwene's face reddened slightly, especially not when you would have to tell her how you knew. "She would box my ears then." I won't do it again. Go rummaging about in people's dreams. Not in Avienda's dreams, anyway. It was not right to spy on a friend's dreams. Not that it was spying exactly, but still. The crowd around Rand was beginning to break up. He swung into his saddle easily, imitated promptly by Natail. One of the traders, a broad-faced, flame-haired woman wearing a small fortune in worked gold, cut gems, and carved ivory, lingered, though. Karakarn, do you mean to leave the threefold land forever? You have spoken as if you will never return. The others stopped at that and turned back. Silence spread on an expanding ripple of murmurs telling what had been asked. For a moment Rand was silent as well, looking around at the faces turned to him. At last he said, I hope to return, but who can say what will happen? The wheel weaves as the wheel wills. He hesitated with every eye on him. But I will leave you something to remember me by, he added, sticking a hand in his coat pocket. Abruptly, a fountain near the roof burst to life, water gushing from the mouths of incongruous porpoises standing on their tails. Beyond that, a statue of a young man with a horn raised to the sky suddenly was putting up a spreading fan, and then 2 stone women farther on were casting sprays of water from their hands. In stunned stillness, the Aiel watched as all the fountains of Roidion flowed once more. I should have done that long since. Rand's mutter was no doubt meant for himself, but in the hush Egwene could hear him quite clearly. The splash of hundreds of fountains was the only other sound. Natail shrugged, as if he had expected no less. It was at Rand that Egwene stared, not the fountains. A man who could channel. Rand. He still ran, despite everything, but each time she saw him do it was like learning that he could all over again. Growing up, she had been taught that only the Dark One was more to be feared than a man who could channel. Maybe Avienda's right to be afraid of him. But when she looked down at Avienda, open wonder shone on her face. So much water delighted the Aiel woman, as the finest silk dress might have Egwene, or a garden full of flowers. It is time to march, Rand announced, reining the dapple westward. Anyone who isn't ready will have to catch up. Natail followed close behind on the mule. Why did Rand let such a bootlicker stay near him? The clan chiefs immediately began passing orders, and the bustle increased tenfold. Maidens and water-seekers darted ahead, and more Far Darais Mai closed around Rand as a guard of honor, incidentally enclosing Natail. Avienda strode beside Giada, right at Rand's stirrup, easily matching the stallion stride for stride, even in her bulky skirts. Falling in beside Matt, behind Rand and his escort, Egwene frowned. Her friend wore that look of grim determination again, as if she had to put her arm into a viper den. I have to do something to help her. Egwene did not give up on a problem once she had her teeth into it. Settling herself in her saddle, Moiraine patted Aldib's arched neck with a gloved hand, but she did not immediately follow Rand. Hadnan Kader was bringing his wagons up the street, driving the lead wagon himself. She should have made him tear that wagon down to carry cargo as she had the other like it. The man was frightened enough of her, of Aes Sedai, to have done it. The door-frame Turangrial was lashed firmly in the wagon behind Kader, canvas tied over it tightly, so no one could fall through by accident again. A long line of Aiel, Sayadun, Black Eyes, strode along on either side of the wagon train. Kader bowed to her from the driver's seat, but her gaze swept on down the line of wagons, all the way to the great square surrounding the forest of slim glass columns, already sparkling in the morning light. She would have taken everything in the plaza if she could, rather than the small fraction that would fit into the wagons. Some were too large, like the 3 dull gray metal rings, each more than 2 paces across, standing on edge and joined at the middle. A braided leather rope had been strung around that one, to warn all from entering without the Wise One's permission. Not that anyone was likely to, of course. Only the clan chiefs and the wise ones entered that square with any sense of ease. Only the wise ones touched anything, and they with something approaching proper reticence. For countless years, the second test faced by an Aiel woman who wanted to be a wise one had been to enter the array of glittering glass columns, seeing exactly what the men saw. More women survived it than men. Bear said it was because women were tougher. Amis that those too weak to survive were winnowed out before reaching that point, but it was not a certainty. Those who did survive were not marked. The wise ones claimed that only men needed visible signs. For a woman to be alive was enough. The first test, the first winnowing before any training even, was to step through one of those 3 rings. Which one did not matter, or perhaps the choice was a matter of fate. That step seemingly took her through her life again and again, her future spread out before her, all of the possible futures based on every decision she might make for the rest of her life. Death was possible in those, too. Some women could not face the future any more than others could face the past. All possible futures were too many for a mind to retain, of course. They jumbled together and faded away for the most part. But a woman gained a sense of things that would happen in her life, that must happen, that might happen. Usually even that was hidden until the moment was on her. Not always, though. Moiraine had been through those rings. A spoonful of hope and a cup of despair, she thought. I do not like seeing you like this, Lan said. From Mandarb's back and his own height, he looked down on her, disquiet creasing the corners of his eyes. For him, that was near tears of frustration from another man. Aiel streamed by on both sides of their horses, and Guyshine with pack animals. Moiraine was startled to realize that Kader's water wagons had already gone by. She had not realized she had been staring at the plaza for so long. Like what? She asked, turning her mare to join the throng. Rand and his escort were already out of the city. Worried, he said bluntly, no readable expression on that stone-carved face now. Afraid. I've never seen you afraid. Not when we had Trollocs and Myrddraal swarming over us. Not even when you learned the Forsaken were loose and Samael was sitting almost on top of us. Is the end coming? She gave a start, and immediately wished she had not. He was looking straight ahead over his stallion's ears, but the man never missed anything. Sometimes she thought he could see a leaf fall behind his back. Do you mean Tarman Gaiden? A red bird in Selysin knows as well as I. The light send not so long as any of the seals remain unbroken. The pair she had were on one of Kader's wagons, too, each packed by itself in a cask stuffed with wool. A different wagon than the red stone doorframe, she had made sure of that. What else could I mean? He asked slowly, still not looking at her and making her wish she had bitten her tongue. You have become impatient. I can remember when you could wait weeks for one tiny scrap of information, one word, without twitching a finger. But now... He did look at her then, a blue-eyed gaze that would have intimidated most women, and most men as well. The oath you gave to the boy, Moiraine. Whatever under the light possessed you. He has been drawing further and further away from me, Lan, and I must be close to him. He needs whatever guidance I can give, and I will do everything short of sharing his bed to see that he gets it. The rings had told her that that would be a disaster. Not that she had ever considered it. The very idea still shocked her. But in the rings it was something she would or could have considered in the future. It was a measure of her growing desperation, no doubt, and in the rings she had seen that it would bring ruination on everything. She wished she could remember how. There were the keys to Randall Thor in anything she could learn about him, but only the simple fact of calamity remained in her mind. Perhaps it will help your humility grow if he tells you to fetch his slippers and light his pipe. She stared at him. Could that be a joke? If so, it was not amusing. She had never found that humility served very well in any situation. Swan claimed that growing up in the Sun Palace in
One
Kyrian
second,
had put
everyone. I'll be
arrogance
right back.
deeply into Moiraine's bones, where she could not even see it, something she firmly denied. But for all that Swan was a Tyran fisherman's daughter, she could match any queen stare for stare, and to her, arrogance meant opposition to her own plans. If Lan was attempting jokes, however feeble and wrong-headed, he was changing. For nearly 20 years he had followed her and saved her life more times than she cared to count, often at great risk to his own. Always he had accounted his life a small thing, valuable only for her need of it. Some said he wooed death the way a bridegroom wooed his bride. She had never held his heart, and never felt jealousy toward the women who seemed to throw themselves at his feet. He had long claimed that he had no heart, but he had found one this past year, found it when a woman tied it on a string to hang around her neck. He denied her, of course, not his love for Nynaeve Almira, once a wisdom in the Two Rivers and now an accepted of the White Tower, but that he could ever have her. He had two things, he said, a sword that would not break and a war that could not end. He would never gift a bride with those. That, at least, Moiraine had taken care of, though he would not know how until it was done. If he did, he would very probably try to change matters, stubborn fool man that he could be. This arid land seems to have withered your own humility, Al Lan Mandragoran. I shall have to find some water to make it grow again. My humility is honed to razor sharpness, he told her dryly. You'll never let it grow too dull. Wetting a white scarf from his leather water bottle, he handed her the sodden cloth. She tied it around her temples without comment. The sun was beginning to rise above the mountains behind them, a searing ball of molten gold. The thick columns snaked up the barren side of Cheandair, its tail still in Rhydion when its head had crested the slope, then down onto rough hilly flats dotted with rock spires and flat-topped buttes, some streaked with red or ochre through the gray or brown. The air was so clear that Moiraine could see for miles, even after they were down off Cheandair. Great natural arches reared, and in every direction jagged mountains clawed at the sky. Dry gullies and hollows split a land sparsely dotted with low thorny bushes and leafless spiny plants. The rare tree, gnarled and stunted, usually bore spines or thorns as well. The sun made it an oven, a hard land that had shaped a hard people. But Lan was not the only one changing, or being changed. She wished she could see what Rand would make of the Aiel in the end. There was a long journey ahead for everyone. Chapter 8. Over the Border. Clinging to her perch at the rear of the jouncing wagon, Nynaeve used one hand for herself and one for her straw hat as she peered back at the furious dust storm dwindling behind them in the distance. The broad brim shaded her face in the morning heat, but the breeze generated by the wagon's rumbling speed was enough to snatch it from her head, despite the dark red scarf tied under her chin. Low-hilled grassland with occasional thickets rolled by, the grass sere and thin in the late summer heat. Dust churned up by the wagon wheels obscured her vision somewhat, and made her cough besides. The white clouds in the sky lied. There had been no rain since before they left Tanchico, weeks earlier, and it had been some time since the wide road had borne the traffic of wagons that once kept it hard packed. No one appeared riding out of that seemingly solid wall of brown, which was just as well. She had lost her anger at brigands trying to stop them this close to escaping the madness of Tarabon, and unless she was angry she could not sense the true source, much less channel. Even angry, she had been surprised at being able to raise such a storm. Once whipped up, full of her fury, it held a life of its own. Elaine had been startled at the size of it too, though thankfully she had not let on to Tom or Julian. But even if her strength was increasing, her teachers in the tower had said that it would, and certainly none of them was strong enough to best one of the Forsaken as she had. Even with that, she still had that limitation. Had any of the bandits appeared, Elaine would have had to deal with them alone, and she did not want that. Her earlier anger was gone, but she was making fine for another crop. Awkwardly climbing up over the canvas lashed across the load of casks, she reached down to one of the water barrels fastened along the sides of the wagon, together with the chests of their possessions and supplies. Immediately her hat was on the back of her head, held only by the scarf. Her fingers could just touch the lid of the barrel, unless she released the rope that she was gripping with her other hand, and the way the wagon was lurching along, that would probably send her off onto her nose. Llewellyn Sandar guided the lanky brown gelding he was riding. Skulker was the improbable name he had put on the animal, close to the wagon, and reached over to hand her one of the leather water bottles slung about his saddle. She drank gratefully, though not gracefully. Hanging there like a bunch of grapes on a wind-blown vine, she spilled nearly as much water down the front of her good gray dress as she did down her throat. It was a suitable dress for a merchant, high-necked, finely woven, and well cut, but still plain. The pin on her breast, a small circle of dark garnets and gold, was perhaps too much for a merchant, but it had been a gift from the Panarch of Tarabon, along with other jewelry, much richer, hidden in a compartment beneath the wagon-driver's seat. She wore it to remind herself that even women who sat on thrones sometimes needed to be taken by the scruff of the neck and shaken. She had a little more sympathy for the tower's manipulations of kings and queens, now that she had dealt with Amathera. She suspected that Amathera had meant her gifts as a bribe to make them depart Tanchico. The woman had been willing to buy a ship so that they would not remain an hour more than necessary, but no one had been willing to sell. The few vessels remaining in Tanchico harbor that were suitable for more than coasting had been jammed with refugees. Besides, a ship was the obvious way, the fastest way to leave, and the Black Adja might well be watching for her and Elaine after what had happened. They had been sent to hunt Aes Sedai, who were dark friends, not to be ambushed by them. Thus the wagon and the long trek across a land torn by civil war and anarchy. She was beginning to wish she had not insisted on avoiding the ships. Not that she would ever admit it to the others. When she tried to hand the water bottle back to Llewellyn, he waved it away. A tough man, seemingly carved from some dark wood, he was not very comfortable on the back of a horse. He looked ridiculous to her, not because of his obvious ill-ease in the saddle, but for the silly red Tarabonner hat that he had taken to wearing on his flat black hair. A brimless, conical thing, tall and flat-topped. It did not go well with his dark Tyran coat, tight to the waist, then flaring. She did not think it would go well with anything. In her opinion, he looked as if he were wearing a cake on his head. It was clumsy, scrabbling the rest of the way forward with the leather bottle in one hand and her hat flapping, and she did it muttering imprecations for the Tyran thief-catcher. Never thief-taker, not him. For Tom Merrilin, puffed-up glee man, and for Elaine of House Tracond, daughter-heir of Andor, who ought to be shaken by the scruff of the neck herself. She meant to slide onto the wooden driver's seat between Tom and Elaine, but the golden-haired girl was pressed tightly against Tom, her own straw hat hanging on her back. She was clutching the white-mustached old fool's arm as if afraid of falling off. Tight-mouthed, Nynaeve had to settle for Elaine's other side. She was glad she had her hair in one proper braid again, wrist-thick and hanging down to her waist. She could give it a tug instead of thumping Elaine's ear for her. The girl had used to seem reasonably sensible, but something seemed to have addled her wits in Tanchico. "They aren't following us any more," Nynaeve announced, pulling her hat back into place. "You can slow this thing down now, Tom." She could have shouted that from the back, and not needed to clamber over the casks, but the image of herself bouncing about and calling for them to slow had stopped her. She did not like making a fool of herself, and liked even less others seeing her in a foolish light. "Put your hat on," she told Elaine. "That fair skin of yours will not appreciate this sun for long." As she had half expected, the girl ignored her friendly advice. "You drive so wonderfully," Elaine gushed as Tom drew back on the reins, pulling the four-horse team to a walk. "You were in control every minute." The tall, wiry man glanced down at her, bushy white eyebrows twitching, but all he said was, "We have more company ahead, child." Well, maybe he was not such a fool. Nynaeve looked and saw the snowy cloaked mounted column approaching them over the next low rise, perhaps 100 men in burnished mail and shining conical helmets, escorting as many heavily laden wagons. Children of the light. She was suddenly very conscious of the leather thong hanging around her neck beneath her dress, and the 2 rings dangling between her breasts. Land's heavy gold signet ring, the ring of the kings of lost Malkir, would mean nothing to the white cloaks, but if they saw the great serpent ring— Fool woman, they aren't likely to unless you decide to undress. Hastily she ran an eye over her companions. Elaine could not stop being beautiful, and now that she had let go of Tom and was retying the green scarf that held her hat, her manner looked more suited to a throne room than a merchant's wagon, but aside from being blue, her dress was no different from Nynaeve's. She wore no jewelry. She had called Amathera's gifts gaudy. She would pass. She had done so 50 times since Tanchico. Barely. Only, this was the first meeting with white cloaks. Tom, in stout brown wool, could have been any of 1,000 gnarled white-haired men who worked wagons. And Julian was Julian. He knew how to behave, though he looked as though he wished he were sure-footed on the ground, with his staff or the slotted sword-breaker he wore at his belt, rather than on a horse. Tom drew the team over to one side of the road and halted as several white cloaks broke away from the head of the column. Nynaeve put on a welcoming smile. She hoped they had not decided that they needed another wagon. "The light illumine you, Captain," she said to the narrow-faced man who was obviously the leader, the only one not carrying a steel-tipped lance. She had no idea what rank the 2 golden knots signified on the breast of his cloak, right below the flaring sunburst they all wore, but in her experience men would accept any flattery. "We are very glad to see you. Bandits tried to rob us a few miles back, but a dust storm appeared like a miracle. We barely You are a merchant?" "Few merchants have come out of Tarabon in some time." The man's voice was as harsh as his face, and that looked as though all joy had been boiled out of it before he left the cradle.
Whoa.
Suspicion filled his dark,
Almost
deep-set
fell
eyes.
and knocked all kind of
Nynaeve
shit
did not
over.
doubt that was permanent, too. "Bound to where? With what?" "I carry dyes, Captain." She worked to maintain her smile under that steady, unblinking stare. It was a relief when he shifted it to the others briefly. Tom was making a good job of appearing bored, just a wagon driver who would be paid stopped or moving. And if Julian had not snatched off that ridiculous hat as he once would have, at least he seemed no more than idly interested, a hired man with nothing to hide. When the white cloak's gaze dropped to Elaine, Nynaeve felt the other woman stiffen and hurried on. "Tarabonner dyes, the finest in the world. I can get a good price for them in Andor." At a signal from the captain, or whatever he was, one of the other white cloaks heeled his horse to the back of the wagon. Slicing one of the ropes with his dagger, he jerked some of the canvas loose, enough to expose 3 or 4 casks. "They're branded Tanchico, Lieutenant. This one says Crimson. Do you want me to break open a few?" Nynaeve hoped the white cloak officer took the anxiety on her face the right way. Even without looking at her, she could all but feel Elaine wanting to call the soldier down for his manners, but any real merchant would be worried at having dyes exposed to the elements. "If you will show me the ones you want opened, Captain, I will be more than happy to do it myself." The man showed no response at all to flattery or offers of cooperation. "The casks were sealed to keep out dust and water, you see. If the cask head is broken, I'll never be able to cover it over with wax again here." The rest of the column reached them and began to pass in a cloud of dust. The wagon drivers were roughly dressed, nondescript men, but the soldiers rode stiffly erect, their long steel lance points all slanted at exactly the same angle. Even sweaty-faced and coated with dust, they looked hard men. Only the drivers glanced at Nynaeve and the others. The white-cloaked lieutenant waved dust away from his face with one gauntleted hand, then motioned the man back from the wagon. His eyes never left Nynaeve. "You come from Tanchico?" Nynaeve nodded, a picture of cooperation and openness. "Yes, Captain. Tanchico." "What word have you of the city? There have been rumors." "Rumors, Captain? When we left there was little reason. The city was full of refugees, and the countryside of rebels and bandits. Trade hardly exists. That was the truth, pure and simple. That's why these dyes will fetch particularly good prices. There will be no more Tarabonner dyes available for a long while, I think." "I do not care about refugees, trade, or dyes, merchant," the officer said in flat tones. "Was Andric still on the throne?" "Yes, Captain." Obviously, rumor said someone had taken Tanchico and supplanted the king, and perhaps someone had. But who? One of the rebel lords who fought each other as hard as they did Andric, or the dragon sworn who had pledged themselves to the dragon reborn without ever seeing him? Andric was still king and Amathera still panarch when we left. His eyes said she could be lying. "It is said the Tarvalan witches were involved. Did you see any Aes Sedai or hear of them?" "No, Captain," she said quickly. The great serpent ring seemed hot against her skin. 50 white cloaks, close at hand. A dust storm would not help this time, and anyway, though she tried to deny it, she was more scared than angry. "Plain merchants don't mingle with that sort." He nodded, and she risked adding a question, anything to change the subject. "If you please, Captain, have we entered Amadisia yet?" "The border is 5 miles east," he pronounced. "For the time being. The first village you come to will be Mardisen. Obey the law and you will be well. There is a garrison of the children there." He sounded as if the garrison would spend all of its time making sure they did obey the law. "Have you come to move the border?" Elaine asked suddenly and coolly. Nynaeve could have strangled her. The deep-set, suspicious eyes shifted to Elaine, and Nynaeve said hastily, "Forgive her, my lord captain. My eldest sister's girl. She thinks she should have been born a lady, and she can't keep away from the boys besides. That's why her mother sent her to me." Elaine's indignant gasp was perfect. It was also probably quite real. Nynaeve supposed she had not needed to add that about boys, but it seemed to fit. The White Cloak stared at them a moment longer, then said, "The Lord Captain Commander sends food into Tarabon. Otherwise we would have Tarabonner vermin over the border and stealing anything they could chew. Walk in the light," he added, before swinging his horse to gallop back to the head of the column. It was neither suggestion nor blessing. Tom got the wagon moving as soon as the officer left, but everyone sat silent, except for coughing, until they were well beyond the last soldier and out of the other wagon's dust. Swallowing a little water to wet her throat, Nynaeve pushed the water bottle at Elaine. "What did you mean back there?" she demanded. "We aren't in your mother's throne room, and your mother would not stand for it anyway." Elaine emptied the rest of the leather bottle before deigning to reply. "You were crawling, Nynaeve." She pitched her voice high in a mock servility. "I am very good and obedient, Captain. May I kiss your boots, Captain?" "We're supposed to be merchants, not queens in disguise. Merchants do not have to be lick-spittles. You are lucky he didn't think we were trying to hide something, acting so servile. They don't stare down their noses at white cloaks with 50 lances either. Or did you think we could overwhelm them all with the power if need be? Why did you tell him I could not keep away from boys? There was no need for that, Nynaeve. I was ready to tell him anything that would make him go away and leave us alone, and you—" "Both of you, shut up!" Tom barked suddenly, "before they come back to see which of you is murdering the other." Nynaeve actually twisted around on the wooden seat to look back before she realized the white cloaks were too far off to hear, even if they had been shouting. Well, maybe they had been. It did not help that Elaine did the same. Nynaeve took a firm hold on her braid and glared at Tom, but Elaine snuggled herself against his arm and practically cooed. "You are right, Tom. I am sorry I raised my voice." Julian was watching them sideways, pretending not to, but he was wise enough not to bring his horse close enough to become part of it. Letting go of her braid before she pulled it out by the roots, Nynaeve adjusted her hat and sat staring straight ahead over the horses. Whatever had gotten into the girl, it was high time to get it out again. Only a tall stone pillar to each side of the road marked the border between Tarabon and Amadisia. There was no traffic on the road but them. The hills gradually became a little higher, but otherwise the land remained much the same, brown grass and thickets with few green leaves except on pine or leatherleaf or other evergreens. Stone-fenced fields and thatch-roofed stone farmhouses dotted the slopes and dells, but they had a look of abandonment. No smoke rising from chimneys, no men working crops, no sheep or cows. Sometimes a few chickens scratched in a farmyard near the road, but they scurried away, gone feral, at the wagon's approach. White Cloak garrison or no, apparently no one was willing to risk Tarabana brigands this close to the border. When Mardison appeared from the top of a rise, the sun still had a long way to climb to its zenith. The town ahead looked too big for the name of village, nearly a mile across, straddling a small bridged stream between two hills, with as many slate roofs as thatched, and considerable bustle in the wide streets. "We need to buy supplies," Nynaeve said, "but we want to be quick about it. We can cover a lot of ground yet before nightfall." "We are wearing out, Nynaeve," Tom said. "First light to last light every day for nearly a month. One day resting will not make much difference in reaching Tar Valon." He did not sound tired. More likely he was looking forward to playing his harp or his flute in one of the taverns, and getting men to buy him wine. Julian had finally brought his mount close to the wagon, and he added, "I could do with a day on my feet. I do not know whether this saddle or that wagon seat is worse." "I think we should find an inn," Elaine said, looking up at Tom. "I have had quite enough of sleeping under this wagon, and I would like to listen to you tell stories in the common room." "One-wagon merchants are little more than peddlers," Nynaeve said sharply. "They cannot afford inns in a town like this." She did not know whether that was true or not, but despite her own desire for a bath and clean sheets, she was not going to let the girl get away with directing the suggestion at Tom. It was not until the words were out of her mouth that she realized that she had given in to Tom and Julian. "One day won't hurt. It's a long way to Tar Valon yet." She wished she had insisted on a ship. With a fast ship, a seafolk raker, they could have gotten to Tyr in a third of what it had taken them to cross Tarabon, as long as they had good winds, and with the right Atha Mier windfinder that would have been no problem. She or Elaine could have handled it, for that matter. The Tyrants knew that she and Elaine were friends of Rand's, and she expected that they still sweated buckets for fear of offending the Dragon Reborn. They would have provided a carriage and escort for the journey up to Tar Valon. "Find us a place to camp," she said reluctantly. She should have insisted on a ship. They might have been back in the tower by now. Chapter 9. A Signal. Nynaeve had to admit that Tom and Julian between them had chosen a good campsite, in a sparse thicket growing on an eastern slope, covered with dead leaves, a scant mile from Mardison. Scattered sour gums and some sort of small, droopy-branched willow screened the wagon from the road and the town, and a 2-foot-wide rivulet ran from a stone outcrop near the top of the rise, down a bed of dried mud twice as broad. Enough water for their purposes. It was even a little cooler under the trees, with a small and welcome breeze. Once the two men had watered the team and hobbled them where the horses could feed on the sparse grass upslope, they tossed a coin to decide which should take the lanky gelding into Mardison to purchase what they needed. The coin flipping was a ritual that they had developed. Tom, whose nimble fingers were used to performing sleight of hand, never lost when he flipped the coin, so Julian always did it now. Tom won anyway, and while he was stripping the saddle from Skulker, Nynaeve put her head under the wagon seat and levered up a floorboard with her belt knife. Besides two small gilded coffers containing Amathera's presents of jewelry, several leather purses bulging lay in the recess. The Panarch had been more than generous in her desire to pay her backs. The other things looked trifling by comparison. A small dark wooden box, polished but plain and uncarved, and a wash-leather purse lying flat and showing the impression of a disc inside. The box held the two Turangrial they had recovered from the Black Aja, both linked to dreams, and the purse, that was their prize from Tanchico, one of the seals on the Dark One's prison. As much as she wanted to find out where Swan Sanche wanted them to chase the Black Aja next, the seal was the source of her haste to reach Tarvalin. Digging coins from one of the fat purses, she avoided touching the flat purse. The longer it remained in her possession, the more she wanted to hand it to the Amerlin and be done with it. Sometimes she thought she could feel the Dark One trying to break through when she was near the thing. She saw Tom off with a pocketful of silver and a strong admonition to search out some fruit and green vegetables. Either man was likely as not to buy nothing but meat and beans, left to himself. Tom's limp as he led the horse off toward the road made her grimace. An old injury, and nothing to be done for it now, so Moiraine said. That rankled as much as the limp itself. Nothing to be done. When she had left the two rivers, it had been to protect young people from her village, snatched away in the night by an Aes Sedai. She had gone to the tower still with the hope that she could somehow shelter them, and the added ambition of bringing down Moiraine for what she had done. The world had changed since then, or maybe she only saw the world differently. No, it is not me that's changed. I'm the same. It is everything else that's different. Now it was all she could do to protect herself. Rand was what he was, and no turning back, and Egwene eagerly went her own way, not letting anyone or anything hold her back even if her way led over a cliff, and Mat had learned to think of nothing but women, carousing, and gambling. She even found herself sympathizing with Moiraine sometimes, to her disgust. At least Perrin had gone back home, or so she had heard through Egwene, second-hand from Rand. Perhaps Perrin was safe. Hunting the Black Aja was good and right and satisfying, and also terrifying, though she tried to hide that part. She was a grown woman, not a girl who needed to hide in her mother's apron. Yet that was not the main reason she was willing to keep on bashing her head against a wall, keep on trying to learn to use the power, when most of the time she could not channel any more than Tom. That reason was the talent called healing. As wisdom of Emond's Field, it had been gratifying to bring the women's circle around to her way of thinking, especially since most were old enough to be her mother. With not many years on Elaine, she had been the youngest wisdom ever in the Two Rivers, and even more so to see that the village council did what they should, stubborn men that they were. The most satisfaction, though, had always come from finding the right combination of herbs to cure an illness, to heal with the one power. She had done it, fumbling, curing what her other skills never could. The joy of it was enough to bring tears. One day she meant to heal Tom and watch him dance. One day she would even heal that wound in Rand's side. Surely there was nothing that could not be healed, not if the woman wielding the power was determined enough. When she turned from watching Tom go, she found that Elaine had filled the bucket that normally hung beneath the wagon and was kneeling to wash her hands and face, a towel around her shoulders to keep her dress dry. That was something she particularly wanted to do herself. In this heat it was pleasant sometimes to wash in water cool from a stream. Often enough there had been no water but what was in the barrels strapped to the wagon, and that was needed for drinking and cooking more than washing. Julian was sitting with his back against one of the wagon wheels, his thumb-thick staff of pale ridged wood leaning next to him. His head was down, that silly hat tipped precariously over his eyes, but she was not willing to bet on even a man sleeping at this time of the morning. There were things he and Tom did not know, things it was best they did not know. The thick carpet of dead sourgum leaves crackled as she seated herself near Elaine. "Do you think Tanchico really has fallen?" Rubbing a soapy cloth slowly across her face, the other woman did not reply. She tried again. "I think that White Cloak's Aes Sedai were us." "Perhaps." Elaine's voice was cool, a pronouncement from the throne. Her eyes were blue ice. She did not look at Nynaeve. "And perhaps reports of what we did got tangled with other rumors. Tarabon could have a new king and a new Panart very easily." Nynaeve kept her temper in check and her hands away from her braid. They clutched her knees instead. "You are trying to put her at ease with you. Watch your tongue." "Amathera was difficult, but I do not wish her any harm. Do you?" "A pretty woman," Jewelin said, "especially in one of those Tarabonner serving girl's dresses, with a pretty smile. I thought she—" He saw Elaine and her looking at him, and quickly pulled his hat back down, pretending to sleep again. She and Elaine shared a glance, and she knew the other's thought was the same as hers. Men. "Whatever has happened to Amathera, Nynaeve? She is behind us now." Elaine sounded more normal. Her washcloth slowed. "I wish her well, but mainly I hope the Black Adja is not behind us. Not following, I mean." Julian stirred uneasily without raising his head. He was still uncomfortable with the knowledge that Black Aes Sedai were real, and not simply a tale in the streets. "He should be happy he doesn't have our knowledge." Nynaeve had to admit that the thought was not entirely logical, but if he had known about the Forsaken being loose, even Rand's foolish instruction to look after her and Elaine would not have kept him from running. Still, he was useful at times, he and Tom both. It had been Moiraine who had fastened Tom to them, and the man knew a great deal about the world for an ordinary gleeman. If they were following, they'd have caught up by now. That was surely true, considering the usual lumbering speed of the wagon. "With any luck, they still do not know who we are." Elaine nodded, grim but her old self again, and began rinsing her face. She could be almost as determined as a Two Rivers woman. "Leandrin and most of her cronies surely escaped from Tanchico, maybe all of them, and we still don't know who is giving orders for the Black Adja in the tower. As Rand would say, we still have it to do, Nynaeve." Despite herself, Nynaeve winced. True, they had a list of 11 names, but once they were back in the tower, almost any Aes Sedai they spoke to might be Black Adja, or any women they encountered on the road. For that matter, anyone they met might be a dark friend, but that was hardly the same thing, not by a wide degree. "More than the Black Adja," Elaine continued. "I worry about Nynaeve put a quick hand on her arm and nodded slightly toward Julian. Elaine coughed and went on as though that was what had stopped her. "About Mother. She has no reason to like you, Nynaeve. Quite the opposite." "She's far away from here." Nynaeve was glad her voice was steady. They were not talking about Elaine's mother, but the Forsaken she had defeated. Part of her hoped fervently that Mogadine was far away, very far. But if she was not? "She is," Nynaeve said firmly, but she still hitched her shoulders uncomfortably. A part of her remembered humiliations suffered at Mogadine's hands, and desired nothing more than to face the woman again, to defeat her again, for good this time. Only, what if Mogadine took her by surprise, came at her when she was not angry enough to channel? The same was true of any of the Forsaken, of course, or of any Black Sister for that matter. But after her rout in Tanchico, Mogadine had reason to hate her personally. Not pleasant at all to think that one of the Forsaken knew your name and likely wanted your head. "That is just rank cowardice," she told herself sharply. "You are not a coward, and you will not be." That did not stop the itch between her shoulder blades every time Mogadine came to mind, as if the woman was staring at her back. "I suppose looking over my shoulder for bandits has made me nervous," Elaine said casually, patting her face with the towel. "Why, Sometimes when I dream of late, I have the feeling that someone is watching me. Nynaeve gave a start at what seemed an echo of her own thoughts, but then she realized there had been a slight emphasis on dream. Not any dreams, but Terai Riod, another thing the men did not know about. She had had the same sensation, but then there was often a feel of unseen eyes in the world of dreams. It could be uncomfortable, but they had discussed the sensation before. She made her voice light. Well, your mother is not in our dreams, Elaine, or she would probably snatch us both up by an ear. Mogadine would probably torture them until they begged for death, or arrange a circle of 13 Black Sisters and 13 Murdral. They could turn you to the shadow against your will that way, bind you to the Dark One. Maybe Mogadine could even do it by herself. Don't be ridiculous, woman. If she could have, she would have. You beat her, remember? I do hope not, the other woman replied soberly. Do you mean to give me a chance to wash? Nynaeve asked irritably. Putting the girl at ease was all very well, but she could do with less talk of Mogadine. The Forsaken had to be somewhere distant. She would not have let them come this far peacefully if she knew where they were. Light send that that's true. Elaine emptied and refilled the bucket herself. She was a very nice girl usually, when she remembered that she was not in the royal palace in Camelin, and when she was not acting the fool. That Nynaeve would take care of when Tom came back. Once Nynaeve had enjoyed a slow, cooling wash of face and hands, she set about making the camp ready, and put Julian to breaking dead branches from the trees for a fire. By the time Tom returned with 2 wicker hampers slung across the gelding's back, her and Elaine's blankets were laid out under the wagon, and the 2 men's under the hanging branches of one of the 20-foot willows. A good supply of firewood had been stacked. The tea kettle stood cooling beside the ashes of a fire in a circle cleared of leaves, and the thick pottery cups had been washed. Julian was grumbling to himself as he caught water in the tiny stream to refill the water barrels. From the snatches Nynaeve heard, she was glad he kept most of it to an inaudible mutter. From her perch on one of the wagon shafts, Elaine hardly tried to hide her interested attempt to make out what he was saying. Both she and Nynaeve had put on clean dresses on the other side of the wagon, switching colors as it happened. After fastening hobbles between the gelding's forelegs, Tom lifted the heavy hampers down easily and began unpacking them. Mardecen's not as prosperous as it looks from a distance. He set a net bag of small apples on the ground, and another of some dark green leafy vegetable. With no trade into Tarabon, the town is withering. The rest seemed to be all sacks of dried beans and turnips, plus pepper-cured beef and salt-cured hams, and a gray pottery bottle sealed with wax that Nynaeve was sure held brandy. Both men had complained of not having a bit of something with their pipes of an evening. You can hardly take 6 steps without seeing a white cloak or 2. The garrison is about 50 men or so, with barracks over the hill from the town on the far side of the bridge. It was considerably larger, but it seems Padron Niall is pulling white cloaks from everywhere into Amador. Knuckling his long mustaches, he looked thoughtful for a moment. I cannot see what he is up to. Tom was not a man who liked that. Usually a few hours in a place was enough for him to begin ferreting out the currents between noble and merchant houses, the alliances and schemes and counterplots that made up the so-called game of houses. The rumors are all about Niall trying to stop a war between Ilian and Altara, or maybe Ilian and Morandi. No reason there for him to be gathering in soldiers. I'll tell you one thing, though. Whatever that lieutenant said, it is a king's tax that buys the food being sent into Tarabon, and the people are not happy with it. Not to feed Taraboners. King Aelron and the Lord Captain Commander are not our concern, Nynaeve said, studying what he had brought. 3 salted hams. We will pass through Amadecia as quickly and unobtrusively as we can. Perhaps Elaine and I will have more luck finding vegetables than you did. Would you care for a walk, Elaine? Elaine got up immediately, smoothing her gray skirts and lifting her hat from the wagon. That would be very nice, after that wagon seat. It might be different if Tom and Julian let me take a turn riding Skulker more often. For once she did not give the old gleeman a coquettish look, which was something. Tom and Julian exchanged glances, and the tyrant thief-catcher pulled a coin from his coat pocket, but Nynaeve gave him no chance to flip it. We will be quite all right by ourselves. We could hardly expect trouble of any sort with so many white cloaks to keep order. Planting her hat on her head, she tied the scarf under her chin and gave them a firm look. Besides, all those things Tom bought need to be put away. Both men nodded, slowly, reluctantly, but they did it. Sometimes they took their roles as supposed protectors entirely too seriously. She and Elaine had reached the empty road and were walking down the verge, on the thin grass, so as not to kick up dust, before she had it settled in her mind how to bring up what she wanted to say. Before she could speak, though, Elaine said, "You obviously want to talk to me alone, Nynaeve. Is it about Mogadine?" Nynaeve blinked and looked at the other woman sideways. It was well to remember that Elaine was no fool. She'd only been acting like one. Nynaeve resolved to keep a tight hold on her temper. This was going to be difficult enough without letting it dissolve into a shouting match. Not that, Elaine. The girl thought they should add Mogadine to their hunt. She could not seem to realize the difference between one of the Forsaken and, say, Leandrin or Chesmal. I thought we should discuss how you've been behaving toward Tom. I do not know what you mean, Elaine said, staring straight ahead toward the town, but sudden spots of color in her cheeks gave her the lie. Not only is he old enough to be your father twice over, but he is not my father, Elaine snapped. My father was Tarangale de Modred, a prince of Kyrian and first prince of the Sword of Andor. Straightening her hat needlessly, she went on in a milder tone, though not by much. I am sorry, Nynaeve. I did not mean to shout. Temper, Nynaeve reminded herself. I thought you were in love with Rand, she said, making her voice gentle. It was not easy. The messages you have me give to Egwene for him certainly say so. I expect you tell her the same. The color in the other woman's face heightened. I do love him, but he is very far away, Nynaeve, in the waste, surrounded by 1,000 maidens of the spear who jump to do his bidding. I cannot see him, speak to him, touch him. She was whispering by the end. You can't think he'll turn to a maiden, Nynaeve said incredulously. He is a man, but he isn't as fickle as that. And besides, one of them would put a spear in him if he looked at her crossways, even if he is this Dawn whatever. Anyway, Egwene says Avienda is keeping an eye on him for you. I know, but I should have made sure that he knew I love him. Elaine's voice was determined and worried. I should have told him so. Nynaeve had hardly looked at a man before Lan, at least not seriously, but she had seen and learned much as wisdom. From her observations, there was no quicker way to send a man running for his life, unless he said it first. I think Min had a viewing, Elaine went on, about me and about Rand. She always used to joke about having to share him, but I think it wasn't a joke, and she could not bring herself to say what it really was. That is ridiculous. It certainly was, though, in Tyr, Avienda had told her of a vile Aiel custom. You share Lan with Moiraine, a small voice whispered. That isn't the same thing at all, she told it briskly. Are you certain Min had one of her visions? Yes. I wasn't at first, but the more I think on it, the more sure I become. She joked about it too often to mean anything else. Well, whatever Min had seen, Rand was no Aiel. Oh, his blood might be Aiel, as the wise ones claimed, but he had grown up in the Two Rivers, and she would not stand by and let him take up wicked Aiel ways. She doubted very much that Elaine would either. "Is that why you've been," she would not say, "throwing yourself at, teasing Tom?" Elaine gave her a sidelong glance, the crimson back in her cheeks. "There are 1,000 leagues between us, Nynaeve. Do you think Rand is refraining from looking at other women? A man is a man, on a throne or in a pigsty." She had a stock of homely sayings from her childhood nurse, a clear-headed woman named Limi, whom Nynaeve wished she would meet one day. "Well, I don't see why you have to flirt just because you think Rand might." She refrained from bringing up Tom's age again. "Man is old enough to be your father," that small voice murmured. "I love Man. If I can only reason out how to get him free of Moiraine, that is not the matter at hand. Tom is a man with secrets, Elaine. Remember that Moiraine sent him with us. Whatever he is no simple country gleeman." "He was a great man," Elaine said softly. "He could have been greater, except for love." With that, Nynaeve's temper snapped. She rounded on the other woman, seizing her by the shoulders. "The man doesn't know whether to turn you over his knee or climb a tree." "I know," Elaine gave a frustrated sigh, "but I do not know what else to do." Nynaeve ground her teeth in the effort not to shake her until her skull rattled. "If your mother heard of this, she'd send Limi to haul you back to the nursery." "I am not a child any longer, Nynaeve." Elaine's voice was strained, and now the flush in her cheeks was not embarrassment. "I am as much a woman as my mother is." Nynaeve stalked on toward Mardison, gripping her braids so hard that her knuckles hurt. After a few strides, Elaine caught up. "Are we really going to buy vegetables?" Her face was composed, her tone light. "Did you see what Tom brought back?" Nynaeve said tightly. Elaine shuddered elaborately. 3 hens, and that awful peppered beef. Do men ever eat anything but meat if it isn't set before them? Nynaeve's temper faded as they walked on, talking about the foibles of the weaker sex, men, of course, and such simple matters as that. Not completely away, of course. She liked Elaine, and enjoyed her company. At times it seemed as if the girl really was Egwene's sister, as they sometimes called each other, when Elaine was not acting the twitch skirt. Tom could put a stop to it, of course, but the old fool indulged Elaine like a fond father with his favorite daughter, even when he did not know whether to say boo or faint. One way or another she meant to get to the bottom of it, not for Rand's sake, but because Elaine was better than this. It was as if she had contracted a strange fever. Nynaeve intended to cure it. Granite slabs paved the streets of Mardison, worn by generations of feet and wagon wheels, and the buildings were all brick or stone. A number of them were empty, though, both shops and houses, sometimes with the front door standing open, so Nynaeve could see the bare interior. She saw 3 blacksmiths' shops, 2 abandoned, and in the third the smith was half-heartedly rubbing his tools with oil, and the forges were cold. One slate-roofed inn, with men sitting morosely on benches out front, had a number of broken windows, and at another the adjoining stable had its doors half off the hinges, and a dusty coach squatting in the stable-yard, one forlorn hen nesting on the driver's high seat. Somebody in that one was playing the bittern, Heron on the Wing, it sounded like, but the tune was dispirited. The door of a third inn was barred by 2 splintery planks nailed across it. People thronged the streets, but they moved lethargically, weighted down by the heat. Dull faces said they had no real reason to stir at all beyond habit. Many women, in large, deep bonnets that almost hid their faces, had on dresses worn at the hem, and more than one man had a frayed collar or cuffs on his knee-length coat. There were indeed white cloaks scattered through the streets, if not so many as Tom had made out, still enough. Nynaeve's breath caught every time she saw a man in a pristine cloak and shining armor look at her. She knew she had not worked with the power nearly long enough to take on Aes Sedai agelessness, but those men might well try to kill her, a Tarvalin witch, and outlawed in Amadisia, if they even suspected a connection to the White Tower. They strode through the crowds, seemingly oblivious of the apparent poverty around them. People moved out of their way respectfully, receiving perhaps a nod, if that, and often a sternly pious "Walk in the light." Ignoring the children of the light as best she could, she set herself to finding fresh vegetables, but by the time the sun reached its peak, a blazing ball of gold that burned through the thin clouds, she and Elaine had wandered both sides of the low bridge, and between them had managed to garner one small bunch of honeypeas, some tiny radishes, a few hard pears, and a basket to carry them in. Perhaps Tom really had looked. This time of year the barrows and stalls should have been full of the summer's produce, but most of what they saw was heaped potatoes and turnips that had known better days. Thinking of all those empty farms approaching the town, Nynaeve wondered how these people were going to make it through the winter. She walked on. Hanging upside down beside the door of a thatch-roofed seamstress's shop was a bunch of what looked almost like broomweed, with tiny yellow flowers, the stalks wrapped their whole length in a white ribbon, then tied with a dangling yellow one. It might have been some woman's feeble attempt at a festive decoration in the midst of hard times, but she was sure it was not. Stopping beside an empty shop with a carving knife incised on the sign still hanging over the door, she pretended to search for a stone in her shoe, while furtively studying the seamstress's shop. The door was open, and colorful bolts of cloth stood in the small-paned windows, but no one went in or out. "Can you not find it, Nynaeve? Take off your shoes." Nynaeve's head jerked. She'd almost forgotten that Elaine was there. No one else was paying any attention to them, and no one looked close enough to overhear. She still lowered her voice. "That bunch of broomweed by that shop door. It is a yellow Ajah signal, an emergency signal, from one of the yellow's eyes and ears." She did not have to tell Elaine not to stare. The girl's eyes barely moved toward the shop. "Are you certain?" she asked quietly. "And how do you know?" "Of course I am certain. It's exact. The hanging bit of yellow ribbon is even split in 3. She paused to take a deep breath. Unless she was completely mistaken, that insignificant fistful of weeds held a dire meaning. If she was wrong, she was making a fool of herself, and she did hate to do that. "I spent a good deal of time talking with yellows in the tower. Healing was the main purpose of the yellows. They did not care much for her herbs, but you did not need herbs when you could heal with the power. One of them told me. She did not think it too great a transgression, since she was sure I'll choose yellow. Besides, it has not been used in nearly 300 years. Elaine, only a few women in each Ajah actually know who the Ajah's eyes and ears are, but a bunch of yellow flowers tied and hung like that tells any yellow sister that here one is, and with a message urgent enough to risk uncovering herself. How are we going to find out what it is?" Nynaeve liked that. Not, "What are we going to do?" The girl had backbone. "Follow my lead," she said, gripping the basket tighter as she straightened. She hoped she remembered everything Shemarin had told her. She hoped Shemarin had told her everything. The plump yellow could be fluttery for an Aes Sedai. The interior of the shop was not large, and every scrap of wall was taken up by shelves holding bolts of silk or finely woven wool, spools of piping and binding, and ribbons and lace of every width and description. Dressmakers' dummies stood about the floor wearing garments ranging from half-made to complete, from something suitable for a dance in embroidered green wool to a pearly gray silk gown that could have done very well at court. At first glance the shop had a look of prosperity and activity, but Nynaeve's sharp eye caught a hint of dust in one high neck of frothy celined lace, and on a large black velvet bow at the waist of another gown. There were two dark-haired women in the shop. One, young and thin and trying to wipe her nose surreptitiously with the back of her hand, held a bolt of pale red silk clutched anxiously to her bosom. Her hair was a mass of long curls to her shoulders in the Amadisian fashion, but it seemed a tangle beside the other woman's neat array. The other, handsome and in her middle years, was assuredly the seamstress, as proclaimed by the large bristling pincushion fastened to her wrist. Her dress was of a good green wool, well cut and well made to show her skill, but only lightly worked with white flowers around the high neck, so as not to overshadow her patrons. When Nynaeve and Elaine walked in, both women gaped, as if none had entered in a year. The seamstress recovered first, regarding them with careful dignity as she made a slight curtsy. "May I serve you? I am Rhonda Macura. My shop is yours." "I want a dress embroidered with yellow roses on the bodice," Nynaeve told her. "But no thorns, mind," she added with a laugh. "I don't heal very fast." What she said did not matter, so long as she included yellow and heal in it. Now, if only that bunch of flowers was not happenstance. If that was the case, she would have to find some reason not to buy a dress with roses, and a way to keep Elaine from recounting the whole miserable experience to Tom and Jewelin. Mistress Macura stared at her for a moment with dark eyes, then turned to the thin girl, pushing her toward the back of the shop. "Go on to the kitchen, Lucy, and make a pot of tea for these good ladies. From the blue canister. The water's hot, thank the light. Go on, girl. Put that down and stop gawking. Quickly, quickly. The blue canister, mind. My best tea," she said, turning back to Nynaeve as the girl vanished through a door at the rear. "I live over the shop, you see, and my kitchen is in the back." She was smoothing her skirts nervously, thumb and forefinger of her right hand forming a circle, for the great serpent ring. There would be no need for an excuse about the dress, it seemed. Nynaeve repeated the sign, and after a moment Elaine did too. "I am Nynaeve, and this is Elaine. We saw your signal." The woman fluttered as if she might fly away. "The signal? Ah, yes, of course." "Well," Nynaeve said, "what is the urgent message?" "We should not talk about that out here. Mistress Nynaeve. Anyone might walk in." Nynaeve doubted that. "I will tell you over a nice cup of tea. My best tea, did I say?" Nynaeve exchanged looks with Elaine. If Mistress Macura was this reluctant to speak her news, it must be appalling indeed. "If we may just step into the back," Elaine said. "No one will hear but us." Her regal tone made the seamstress stare. For a moment Nynaeve thought it might cut through her nervousness, but the next instant the fool woman was babbling again. "The tea will be ready in a moment. The water's already hot. We used to get Tarabonner tea through here. That is why I am here, I suppose. Not the tea, of course. All the trade that used to be, and all the news that came both ways with the wagons. You are mainly interested in outbreaks of disease or a new kind of illness, but I find that interesting myself. I dabble a little with—" She coughed and rushed on. If she smoothed her dress any harder, she would wear a hole in it. "Some about the children, of course, but you are not much interested in them, really." "The kitchen, Mistress Macura," Nynaeve said firmly as soon as the other woman paused for breath. If the woman's news made her this afraid, Nynaeve would brook no more delay in hearing it. The door at the back opened enough to admit Lucy's anxious head. "It's ready, mistress," she announced breathlessly. "This way, Mistress Nynaeve," the seamstress said, still rubbing the front of her dress. "Mistress Elaine." A short hallway led past narrow stairs to a snug, beam-ceilinged kitchen with a steaming kettle sitting on the hearth and tall cupboards everywhere. Copper pots hung between the back door and the window that looked out into a small yard with a high wooden fence. The small table in the middle of the floor held a brilliant yellow teapot, a green honey jar, 3 mismatched cups in as many colors, and a squat blue pottery canister with the lid beside it. Mistress Makira snatched the canister, lidded it, and hastily put it into a cupboard that held more in 24 shades and hues. "Sit, please," she said, filling the cups. "Please." Nynaeve took a ladder-back chair next to Elaine, and the seamstress set cups in front of them, flitting to one of the cupboards for pewter spoons. "The message?" Nynaeve said as the woman sat down across from them. Mistress Makira was too nervous to touch her own teacup, so Nynaeve stirred a little honey into hers and took a sip. It was hot, but had a cool, minty aftertaste. Hot tea might settle the woman's nerves, if she could be made to drink. "A pleasant taste," Elaine murmured over the edge of her cup. "What sort of tea is it?" Good girl, Nynaeve thought. But the seamstress's hands only fluttered beside her cup. "A Tarabana tea, from near the Shadow Coast." Sighing, Nynaeve took another swallow to settle her own stomach. "The message," she said insistently. "You did not hang that signal to invite us for tea. What is your urgent news?" "Ah, yes." Mistress Makira licked her lips, eyed them both, then said slowly, "It came near a month ago, with orders that any sister passing through heard it at all costs." She wet her lips again. "All sisters are welcome to return to the White Tower. The tower must be whole and strong." Nynaeve waited for the rest, but the other woman fell silent. This was the dire message? She looked at Elaine, but the heat seemed to be catching up to the girl. Drooping in her chair, she was staring at her hands on the table. "Is that all of it?" Nynaeve demanded, and surprised herself by yawning. The heat must be reaching her, too. The seamstress only watched her intently. "I said," Nynaeve began, but suddenly her head felt too heavy for her neck. Elaine had slumped onto the table, she realized, eyes closed and arms hanging limply. Nynaeve stared at the cup in her hands with horror. "What did you give us?" she said thickly. That minty taste was still there, but her tongue felt swollen. "Tell me." Letting the cup fall, she levered herself up against the table, knees wobbling. "The light burn you. What?" Mistress Makira scraped back her chair and stepped out of reach, but her earlier nervousness was now a look of quiet satisfaction. Blackness rolled in on Nynaeve. The last thing she heard was the seamstress's voice. "Catch her, Lucy." Chapter 10. Figs and Mice. Elaine realized that she was being carried upstairs by her shoulders and ankles. Her eyes opened, she could see, but the rest of her body might as well have belonged to someone else for all the control she had over it. Even blinking was slow. Her brain felt crammed full of feathers. "She's awake, mistress," Lucy shrilled, nearly dropping her feet. "She's looking at me." "I told you not to worry." Mistress Makira's voice came from above her head. "She cannot channel or twitch a muscle, not with forkroot tea in her. I discovered that by accident, but it has certainly come in handy." It was true. Elaine sagged between them like a doll with half the stuffing gone, bumping her bottom along the steps, and she could as well have run as channeled. She could sense the true source, but trying to embrace it was like trying to pick up a needle on a mirror with cold-numbed fingers. Panic welled up, and a tear slid down her cheek. Perhaps these women meant to turn her over to the White Cloaks for execution, but she could not make herself believe that the White Cloaks had women setting traps in the hope that an Aes Sedai might wander in. That left dark friends, and almost certainly serving the Black Ajah right along with the Yellow. She would surely be put in the hands of the Black Ajah unless Nynaeve had escaped. But if she was to escape, she could not count on anyone else, and she could neither move nor channel. Suddenly she realized that she was trying to scream and producing only a thin, gurgling mewl. Halting it took all the strength she had left. Nynaeve knew all about herbs, or claimed she did. Why had she not recognized whatever that tea was? Stop this whining." The small, firm voice in the back of her head sounded remarkably like Leanie. "A shoat squealing under a fence just attracts the fox, when it should be trying to run." Desperately, she set herself to the simple task of embracing Saidar. It had been a simple task, but now she might as well have been attempting to reach Saidin. She kept on, though. It was the only thing she could do. Mistress Makura, at least, seemed to have no worry. As soon as they had dropped Elaine onto a narrow bed in a small, close room with one window, she hustled Lucy right out again, with not even a backward glance. Elaine's head had fallen so she could see another cramped bed, and a high chest with tarnished brass pulls on the drawers. She could move her eyes, but shifting her head was beyond her. In a few minutes the two women returned, puffing, with Nynaeve slung between them, and heaved her onto the other bed. Her face was slack and glistening with tears, but her dark eyes, fury filled them, and fear too. Elaine hoped anger was uppermost. Nynaeve was stronger than she when she could channel. Perhaps Nynaeve could manage where she was failing miserably, time after time. Those had to be tears of rage. Telling the thin girl to stay there, Mistress Makura hurried out once more, this time coming back with a tray that she placed atop the high chest. It held the yellow teapot, one cup, a funnel, and a tall hourglass. "Now, Lucy, mind you pour a good 2 ounces into each of them as soon as that hourglass empties. As soon, mind." "Why don't we give it to them now, mistress?" the girl moaned, wringing her hands. "I want them to go back to sleep. I don't like them looking at me." "They would sleep like the dead, girl, and this way we can let them rouse just enough to walk when we need them to. I will dose them more properly when it's time to send them off. They'll have headaches and stomach cramps to pay for it, but no more than they deserve, I suppose." "But what if they can channel, mistress? What if they do? They're looking at me." "Stop blathering, girl," the older woman said briskly. "If they could, don't you think they would have by now? They are helpless as kittens in a sack, and they will stay that way as long as you keep a good dose in them. Now you do as I told you, understand? I must go tell old Avi to send off one of his pigeons and make a few arrangements, but I will be back as soon as I can. You had better brew another pot of fork root, just in case. I'll go out the back. Close up the shop. Someone might wander in, and that would never do." After Mistress Makura left, Lucy stood staring at them for a while, still wringing her hands, then finally scurried out herself. Her sniffling faded down the stairs. Elaine could see sweat beading on Nynaeve's brow. She hoped it was effort, not the heat. "Try, Nynaeve." She herself reached for the true source, fumbling clumsily through the wads of wool that seemed to pack her head. Failed, tried again and failed, tried again. "Oh, light, try, Nynaeve, try." The hourglass filled her eyes. She could not look at anything else. Sand pouring down, each grain marking another failure on her part. The last grain dropped, and Lucy did not come. Elaine strained harder for the source to move. After a bit, the fingers of her left hand twitched. Yes! A few minutes more and she could lift her hand. Only a feeble inch before it fell again, but it had lifted. With an effort she could turn her head. "Fight it," Nynaeve mumbled thickly, barely intelligible. Her hands were gripping the coverlet under her tightly. She seemed to be trying to sit up. Not even her head lifted, but she was trying. Elaine tried to say. It sounded more like a grunt to her ears. Slowly she managed to raise her hand to where she could see it and hold it there. A thrill of triumph shot through her. "Stay afraid of us, Lucy. Stay down there in the kitchen a little while longer and—" The door banged open, and sobs of frustration racked her as Lucy dashed in. She had been so close. The girl took one look at them and with a yelp of pure terror darted for the high chest. Elaine tried to fight her, but thin as she was, Lucy batted her floundering hands away effortlessly, forced the funnel between her teeth just as easily. The girl panted as if running. Cold, bitter tea filled Elaine's mouth. She stared up at the girl in a panic that Lucy's face shared. But Lucy held Elaine's mouth shut and stroked her throat with a grim if fearful determination until she swallowed. As darkness overwhelmed Elaine, she could hear liquid sounds of protest coming from Nynaeve. When her eyes opened again, Lucy was gone, and the sands trickled through the glass again. Nynaeve's dark eyes were bulging. Whether in fear or anger, Elaine could not have said. No, Nynaeve would not give in. That was one of the things she admired in the other woman. Nynaeve's head could have been on the chopping block, and she would not give up. Our heads are on the block. It made her ashamed that she was so much weaker than Nynaeve. She was supposed to be Queen of Andor one day, and she wanted to howl with terror. She did not, even in her head. Doggedly she went back to trying to force her limbs to move, to trying to touch Saidar, but she wanted to. How could she ever be a queen when she was so weak? Again she reached for the source. Again, racing the grains of sand. Again. Once more the glass emptied itself without Lucy. Ever so slowly she reached the point where she could raise her hand again, and then her head, even if it did flop back immediately. She could hear Nynaeve muttering to herself, and she could actually understand most of the words. The door crashed open once more. Elaine lifted her head to stare at it despairingly, and gaped. Tom Maryland stood there like the hero of one of his own tales, one hand firmly gripping the neck of a Lucy near fainting, the other holding a knife ready to throw. Elaine laughed delightedly, though it came out more like a croak. Roughly he shoved the girl into a corner. "You stay there, or I'll strop this blade on your hide." In 2 steps he was at Elaine's side, smoothing her hair back, worry painting his leathery face. "What did you give them, girl? Tell me, or—" "Not her," Nynaeve muttered. "Other one. Went away. Help me up. Have to walk." Tom left her reluctantly, Elaine thought. He showed Lucy his knife again, threateningly. She cowered as if she never meant to move again, then made it disappear up his sleeve in a twinkling. Hauling Nynaeve to her feet, he began walking her up and down the few paces the room allowed. She sagged against him limply, shuffling. "I'm glad to hear this frightened little cat didn't trap you," he said. "If she had been the one—" He shook his head. No doubt he would think just as little of them if Nynaeve told him the truth. Elaine certainly did not intend to. "I found her rushing up the stairs, so panicked she did not even hear me behind her. I'm not so glad that another one got away without Julian seeing her. Is she likely to bring others back?" Elaine rolled over onto her side. "I do not think so, Tom," she mumbled. "She can't let too many people know about herself." In another minute she might be able to sit up. She was looking right at Lucy. The girl flinched and tried to shrink through the wall. "The White Cloaks would take her as quickly as they would us." "Julian?" Nynaeve said. Her head wavered as she glared up at the Gleeman. She had no trouble speaking, though. "I told the pair of you to stay with the wagon." Tom blew out his mustaches irritably. "You told us to put up the supplies, which did not take 2 men. Julian followed you, and when none of you came back, I went looking for him." He snorted again. "For all he knew, there were a dozen men in here, but he was ready to come in after you alone. He is tying Skulker in the back. A good thing I decided to ride in. I think we'll need the horse to get you 2 out of here." Elaine found that she could sit up, barely, pulling herself hand over hand along the coverlet, but an effort to stand nearly put her flat again. Saidar was as unobtainable as ever. Her head still felt like a goose-down pillow. Nynaeve was beginning to hold herself a little straighter, to lift her feet, but she still hung on Tom. Minutes later, Julian arrived, pushing Mistress Makira ahead of him with his belt knife. "She came through a gate in the back fence. Thought I was a thief. It seemed best to bring her on in." The seamstress's face had gone so pale at the sight of them that her eyes seemed darker, and about to come out of her head besides. She licked her lips and smoothed her skirt incessantly, and cast quick little glances at Julian's knife, as if wondering whether it might not be best to run away. For the most part, though, she stared at Elaine and Nynaeve. Elaine thought it an even chance whether she would burst into tears or swoon. "Put her over there," Nynaeve said, nodding to where Lucy still shivered in the corner with her arms wrapped around her knees. "And help Elaine. I never heard of fork root, but walking seems to help the effects pass. You can walk most things off." Julian pointed to the corner with his knife, and Mistress Mercura scurried to it and sat herself down beside Lucy, still wetting her lips fearfully. "I would not have done what I did, only I had orders. You must understand that. I had orders." Gently helping Elaine to her feet, Julian supported her in walking the few steps available, crisscrossing the other pair. She wished it were Tom. Julian's arm around her waist was much too familiar. "Orders from whom?" Nynaeve barked. "Who do you report to in the tower?"
Hey, Mix,
The
how you
seamstress
doing?
looked sick, but she clamped her
Hope you're
mouth
doing
shut
well.
determinedly. "If you don't talk," Nynaeve told her, scowling, "I'll let Julian have you. He's a tyrant thief-catcher, and he knows how to bring out a confession as quickly as any white-cloak questioner. Don't you, Julian?" "Some rope to tie her," he said, grinning a grin so villainous that Elaine almost tried to step away from him. "Some rags to gag her until she is ready to talk. Some cooking oil and salt." His chuckle curdled Elaine's blood. "She will talk." Mistress Mercura held herself rigidly against the wall, staring at him, eyes as wide as they would go. Lucy looked at him as if he had just turned into a Trolloc, 8 feet tall and complete with horns. "Very well," Nynaeve said after a moment. "You should find everything you need in the kitchen, Julian." Elaine shifted a steady look from her to the thief-catcher and back. Surely they did not really mean to... Not Nynaeve. "Narenwin Barda!" the seamstress gasped suddenly. Words tripped over one another, spilling out of her. "I send my reports to Narenwin Barda, at an inn in Tarvalin called the Upriver Run. Avi Shendar keeps pigeons for me on the edge of town. He doesn't know who I send messages to or who I get them from, and he does not care. His wife has the falling sickness, and..." She trailed off, shuddering and watching Julian. Elaine knew Narenwin, or at least had seen her in the tower. A thin little woman you could forget was there, she was so quiet. And kind, too. One day a week she let children bring their pets to the tower grounds for her to heal. Hardly the sort of woman to be Black Ajah. On the other hand, one of the Black Ajah names they knew was Marilyn Gamalfin. She liked cats, and went out of her way to look after strays. "Narenwin Barda," Nynaeve said grimly. "I want more names, inside the tower or out." "I don't have any more," Mistress Mercura said faintly. "We will see about that. How long have you been a dark friend? How long have you served the Black Ajah?" An indignant squall erupted from Lucy. "We aren't dark friends." She glanced at Mistress Mercura and sidled away from her. "At least I'm not. I walk in the light, I do." The other woman's reaction was no less strong. If her eyes had bulged before, they popped now. "The Black? You mean it really exists? But the tower has always denied. Why, I asked Narenwin the day she chose me for the yellow's eyes and ears, and it was the next morning before I could stop weeping and crawl out of my bed. I am not a dark friend. Never. I serve the yellow Ajah. The yellow." Still hanging on to Julian's arm, Elaine exchanged puzzled looks with Nynaeve. Any dark friend would deny it, of course, but there seemed a ring of truth in the women's voices. Their outrage at the accusation was nearly enough to overcome their fear. From the way Nynaeve hesitated, she heard the same thing. "If you served the yellow," she said slowly, "why did you drug us?" "It was her," the seamstress replied, nodding at Elaine. I was sent her description a month since, right down to that way she holds her chin sometimes, so she seems to be looking down at you. Narenwin said she might use the name Elaine, and even claimed to be of a noble house. Word by word, her anger over being called a dark friend seemed to bubble higher. Maybe you are a yellow sister, but she's no Aes Sedai, just a runaway accepted. Narenwin said I was to report her presence and that of anyone with her, and to delay her if I could, or even capture her, and anyone with her. How they expected me to capture an accepted I do not know. I don't think even Narenwin knows about my fork-root tea, but that is what my orders said. They said I should risk exposure even, here, where it'd be my death, if I had to. You just wait until the Amerlin puts her hands on you, young woman, on all of you. The Amerlin? Elaine exclaimed. What does she have to do with this? It was on her orders. By order of the Amerlin seat, it said. It said the Amerlin herself said I could use any means short of killing you. You will wish you were dead when the Amerlin gets hold of you. Her sharp nod was full of furious satisfaction. Remember that we are not in anyone's hands yet, Nynaeve said dryly. You are in ours. Her eyes looked as shocked as Elaine felt, though. Was any reason given? The reminder that she was the captive sapped the brief burst of spirit from the woman. She sagged listlessly against Lucy, each keeping the other from falling over. No. Sometimes Narenwin gives a reason, but not this time. Did you intend to just keep us here drugged until someone came for us? I was going to send you off by cart, dressed in some old clothes. Not even a shred of resistance remained in the woman's voice. I sent a pigeon to tell Narenwin you were here and what I was doing. Theron Lugay owes me a strong favor, and I meant to give him enough fork-root to last all the way to Tar Valon if Narenwin didn't send sisters to meet you sooner. He thinks you are ill, and the tea is the only thing keeping you alive until an Aes Sedai can heal you. A woman has to be careful, dealing in remedies in Amadicia. Cure too many or too well, somebody whispers Aes Sedai, and the next you know, your house is burning down. Or worse. Theron knows to hold his tongue about what he... Nynaeve made Tom help her closer, where she could stare down at the seamstress. And the message? The real message? You did not put that signal out in the hope of luring us in. I gave you the real message, the woman said wearily. I did not think it could do any harm. I don't understand it, and Please! Suddenly she was sobbing, clinging to Lucy as hard as the younger woman did to her, both of them wailing and babbling. Please, don't let him use the salt on me. Please, not the salt. Oh, please. Tie them up, Nynaeve said disgustedly after a moment, and we will go downstairs where we can talk. Tom helped her to sit on the edge of the nearest bed, then quickly cut strips from the other coverlet. In short order, both women were bound, back to back, the hands of one to the feet of the other, with wadded bits of coverlet tied in for gags. The pair were still weeping when Tom assisted Nynaeve from the room. Elaine wished she could walk as well as the other woman, but she still needed Julian's support not to go tumbling down the stairs. She felt a small stab of jealousy watching Tom with his arm around Nynaeve. You are a foolish little girl, Linley's voice said sharply. I am a
What are
grown
you up
woman,
to,
she
miss?
told it with a firmness she would not have dared with her old nurse, even today. I do love Rand, but he is far away, and Tom is sophisticated and intelligent, and... It sounded too much like excuses, even to her. Linny would have given the snort that meant she was about to stop tolerating foolishness. Julian, she asked hesitantly, what were you going to do with the salt and the cooking oil? Not exactly, she added more quickly. Just a general idea. He looked at her for a moment. I do not know, but they did not either. That is the trick of it. Their minds made up worse than I ever could. I have seen a tough man break, when I sent for a basket of figs and some mice. You have to be careful, though. Some will confess anything, true or not, just to escape what they imagine. I do not think those two did, though. She did not either. She could not repress a shiver, however. What would somebody do with figs and mice? She hoped she stopped wondering before she gave herself nightmares. By the time they reached the kitchen, Nynaeve was tottering about without help, poking into the cupboard full of colorful canisters. Elaine needed one of the chairs. The blue canisters sat on the table, and a full green teapot, but she tried not to look at them. She still could not channel. She could embrace Saidar, yet it slipped away as soon as she did. At least she was confident now that the power would return to her. The alternative was too horrible to contemplate, and she had not let herself until this moment. "Tom," Nynaeve said, lifting the lids on various containers and peering in. "Jewelin." She paused, took a deep breath, and still not looking at the two men, said, "Thank you. I begin to see why Aes Sedai have warders. Thank you very much." Not all Aes Sedai did. Reds considered all men tainted because of what men who could channel did, and a few never bothered because they did not leave the tower or simply did not replace a warder who died. The Greens were the only Aja to allow bonding with more than one warder. Elaine wanted to be a Green. Not for that reason, of course, but because the Greens called themselves the Battle Aja. Where Browns searched for lost knowledge and Blues involved themselves in causes, Green sisters held themselves ready for the last battle, when they would go forth, as they had in the Trolloc Wars, to face new dreadlords. The two men stared at one another in open amazement. They had surely been ready for the usual rough side of Nynaeve's tongue. Elaine was almost as shocked. Nynaeve liked having to be helped as much as she liked being wrong. Either made her as prickly as a briar, though of course she always claimed to be a picture of sweet reason and sense. "A wisdom." Nynaeve took a pinch of powder from one of the canisters and sniffed it, touched it to the tip of her tongue. Or whatever they call it here. "They don't have a name for it here," Tom said. "Not many women follow your old craft in Amadisia. Too dangerous. For most of those, it's only a sideline." Pulling a leather scrip from the bottom of the cupboard, Nynaeve began making up small bundles from some of the containers. "And who do they go to when they're ill? A hedge doctor?" "Yes," Elaine said. It always pleased her to show Tom that she knew things about the world, too. "In Amadisia, it is men who study herbs." Nynaeve frowned scornfully. "What could a man ever know about curing anything? I'd as soon ask a farrier to make a dress." Abruptly, Elaine realized that she had been thinking of anything and everything except what Mistress Makura had said. "Not thinking about a thorn doesn't make it hurt your foot less." One of Leni's favorites. "Nynaeve, what do you think that message means? All sisters are welcome to return to the tower? It makes no sense." That was not what she wanted to say, but at least she was closing in on it. "The tower has its own rules," Tom said. "What Aes Sedai do, they do for reasons of their own, and often not for those they give, if they give reasons at all." He and Jewelin knew they were only accepted, of course. That was at least part of why neither man did as he was told nearly as well as he might. The struggle was plain on Nynaeve's face. She did not like being interrupted or people answering for her. There was quite a list of things Nynaeve did not like. But it was only a moment since she'd thanked Tom. It could not be easy to call down a man who had just saved you from being hauled off like a cabbage. "Very little in the tower makes sense most of the time," she said sourly. Elaine suspected that the tartness was as much for Tom as the tower. "Do you believe what she said?" Elaine took a deep breath. "About the Amerlin saying I was to be brought back by any means?" The brief look Nynaeve gave her was touched with sympathy. "I don't know, Elaine." She was telling the truth. Jewelin turned one of the chairs around and straddled it. leaning his staff against the back. I've questioned enough thieves and murderers to know truth when I hear it. Part of the time she was too frightened to lie, and the rest too angry. The pair of you. Taking a deep breath, Nynaeve tossed the scrip onto the table and folded her arms as if to trap her hands away from her braid. I am afraid Jewelin is probably right, Elaine. But the Amelin knows what we are doing. She sent us out of the tower in the first place. Nynaeve sniffed loudly. I can believe anything of Swan Sanche. I would like to have her for 1 hour where she could not channel. We would see how tough she is then. Elaine did not think that would make any difference. Remembering that commanding blue gaze, she suspected Nynaeve would earn a fine lot of bruises in the unlikely event that she ever got her wish. But what are we to do about it? The Ajas have eyes and ears everywhere, it seems, and the Amelin herself. We could have women trying to slip things into our food all the way to Tarvalon. Not if we do not look like what they expect. Lifting a yellow jug out of the cupboard, Nynaeve set it on the table beside the teapot. This is white hen pepper. It will soothe a toothache, but it will also turn your hair black as night. Elaine put a hand to her red-gold tresses. Her hair, not Nynaeve's, she would wager. But as much as she hated the idea, it was a good one. A little needlework on some of those dresses in the front, and we are not merchants anymore, but two ladies traveling with their servants. Riding on a wagon load of dye, Jewelin said. Her level look said gratitude for saving her extended only so far. There is a coach in a stable yard on the other side of the bridge. I think the owner will sell it.
All right, everyone, I'm gonna call into this live for tonight. But I want to thank everyone for stopping by and everyone who continues to stop by. I definitely appreciate all y'all's support. Till next time, everyone. Y'all stay safe